This is Synchronicity.
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 Welcome to Synchronicity. My guest this week is Jill Schock. Jill's a death doula, so we know what a birthing doula is. That's someone who aids and facilitates the birthing process. A death doula is someone who aids and facilitates the dying process, both for the person who would be dying and the people around them. Because this is, as you'll hear in this episode, there's not a lot of clarity, not a lot of experience, not a lot of practice with dying for the vast majority of people, if not almost all of them, especially in this country in the West. So she helps bring awareness to that. She helps kind of destigmatize some of the connotations around death, the negative connotations. We tend to not look at and face things that we're afraid of or that scare us. We can refer to these as like psychological complexes, shadow sides and things like that. But one of the biggest of these, which is like this creepy specter looming in the darkness ahead, is death, because it's one of the few things in life that's guaranteed for everything. So we don't like to look at that because it means that these worlds, these castles made of sand that we built for us, this existence, which can be both heavenly and hellish, one day we won't be here for that. And the people we love won't be here. And so this is a lot of heavy stuff. And we just, rather than deal with that, we just go and say, fuck it. I'm not going to think about this anymore. I'm not going to be tuned into this. It's morbid. It's disturbing. I'm afraid of it. I don't want to look at it. And obviously, as we know, that causes a lot of trouble, not just individually, but collectively. So anyone who's bringing more awareness to the topic and subjects of death and dying, I love. I just think it's a really, really noble thing to do. And it's something you really can't fake. You know what I mean? Like, no one is like, you know what, let me force myself to engage with death. I don't think there's value in this. I'm just going to do it because I think people like it. People don't do that. You do this because you have a real passion for it and find it to be helpful, right? What she's doing is helping people with this process, demystifying, having people come up with plans so it's not a burden for them and the people around them. A lot of really just positive stuff that I think genuinely would help almost anyone, especially anyone who's gone through losing someone and having to deal with the ramifications of that, not just fiscally, but emotionally, psychologically, and all the things that come with that. Having someone to speak to about that alone is worth its weight in gold, if you ask me. So this episode, we deal with not just the practical aspects of death and dying, although there's a lot of that. We deal with some of the more, what do we think happens, reincarnation. If you listen to this podcast, you pretty much know my stances on that. But it's fun to hear from someone, and interesting to hear from someone who's around dying people all the time. I've been around 2 dying people in my life. That's not that many. She's been around a lot more. And to see the stages that people go through physically, emotionally, spiritually, that's gotta be, it's like psychedelics. If you've heard Ram Dass ever talk about being with dying people, it's a very psychedelic experience. There's a space that opens up that is just pretty nuts. It just alters your perception of reality. It's like taking a conscious altering drug. So we get into psychedelics talk at the end of this episode. So rather than give the entire episode away, how about you just listen to it? That's a good idea. You can find Jill at her website, deathdoulala.com. I'll have links to all this stuff on syncpodcast.com, mindpodnetwork.com, where else? Episode notes, podcast pages, all that stuff. Speaking of Mindpod Network, redoing the site, moving it from WordPress to Squarespace. This is not an ad for Squarespace, but I'm moving it there. It's been a long, arduous journey exporting a ton of content in a ton of categories, but that'll be happening hopefully in the next month. So stay tuned for that. Speaking of not ads, here's an actual ad. Four Sigmatic. Guess what? Guess how I know Jill and how we connected? Through Michael Donovan and Kelly McLean. Kelly McLean introduced me to Four Sigmatic. Four Sigmatic sponsors this show, so tied it all together. Amazing. foursigmatic.com/sync, SYNC. If you use that, go to that link. There are links on this. Again, everywhere else, there were links before. There's where links where this is now. Click that, go there, 15% off your order. Right? That's pretty cool. Mushroom coffee, mushroom tea, mushroom hot cocoa. It doesn't taste like mushrooms. It's not weird. It's not gross. I drink it. It's not terrible at all. It's actually quite good. So if you've ever been interested, if you have somehow you're a podcast listener and haven't heard of Four Sigmatic, now's your opportunity. I'm the first one to introduce you. The chances of that are virtually zero, but off chance you have and you're like, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. Go through that link, use that link, and then it looks like I'm doing my job good. So do that. We'll be happy. I have new sponsors coming in next week. You're going to hear all about them. I am pretty excited too about them. So we'll talk about all that. You get the down low on how we're trying to monetize a podcast without being shitty, only supporting people who are aligned with what this podcast stands for. Really easier said than done in terms of offers and how people monetize podcasts. So one day we'll have an episode just about the business of podcasting. Learned so many things over the past few years, seen so many people have different levels of success in different ways, and see how people look at numbers and download. It's very interesting stuff to me, at least. So maybe one day we'll do an episode about that. I've rambled on enough here. Let's get back to the topic at hand. The death doula, Jill Schock. Here she is. Without further ado, Jill Schock. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Noah.
My pleasure. I'm glad we're connected. Two people I know and admire and respect very much, Kelly McLean and Michael Donovan, both have recommended I have you on and connect with you in general. And then I've, listened to you, and I was just saying a little off air. I'm particularly excited for this episode for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons is you. And kind of like what you bring to this whole kind of death and mortality thing that I think is really, really, really important, and also something that is shied away from almost all of the time. So I'm just excited for this.
Heck yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I tried to figure out where to start with this, and then I just started with the most obvious place for me, at least regarding death. And you're a death doula. People will know from the intro going in kind of what that is. My best explanation, but I'm curious, like, death for me, the first thing that comes up is fear. Right. It's without a doubt, even for someone like me who is very kind of woo and new agey and just not totally buying that reality is as real as we like to believe it is. I still, when faced with my own mortality, but especially the mortality of people I love and care about, my kid and my wife and my family, it freaks me out. And whenever I get freaked out, I've learned after like 35 years, I get really angry. Like, it's very easy for me to just get in this weird like space of not being in control of anything, which death is kind of the ultimate thing of that. So like, we know there's a ton of fear associated with death for almost everyone. What inspired you to move towards something that's so associated with fear and kind of pain and suffering? Like, what was the motivating factor to get you into doing what you're doing?
Okay. Well, there's two things here that I'm pulling out. One is that a fear of death and the denial and sort of anger that goes along with it is totally normal.
Yeah.
If people say like, I mean, I accept death. That's how I cope with my fear. But if we look at the work of Ernest Becker, and now more modernly, we have Dr. Sheldon Solomon talking about terror management theory, which is basically how we've built up coping mechanisms our entire life to sort of manage our denial of death.
Right.
So if we have these fears, which we all do, myself included, it's totally normal. And, as you go through your dying process, whenever you do have that, it's something you work through naturally. I never thought I would be working in healthcare or with the dying ever. I graduated college to work in museums. And I was really happy doing this work. Like I was like I did archives. So I was like a basement rat, just, with my earbuds in and stuff. And I was having a great time, but I was engaged to be married to someone at that time. And actually his father suffered a brain aneurysm and consequently died from that, which is a very chaotic way to die.
Yeah.
Someone's on a ventilator, they look like they're breathing, but they're actually dead. It's really complicated. So I went through that with this man and this family, and I was shattered, by grief and death. And I came out with this one big question of like, why didn't anybody help us? So I turned my life around. We didn't end up getting married. We canceled the wedding and everything. But I turned my life around and I started to, study and work with people whose life had been interrupted by crisis and death and illness. So yeah, I had a lot of fears coming into this too. And it's totally normal, but that's where I started.
Well, I mean, I'm glad to hear that like you didn't grow up being like, yeah, I was just fascinated with death and I always wanted to know and I knew I was always going to do this. Like, because to me, that's different than actually having the genuine experience of facing it. And then because of that lack of support, as you described it, and just kind of this as well as anyone, there's just not even a dialogue about this stuff. How often do we talk about death? Just like we shy away from it as much as possible. And that speaks to how fearful we are of it. So, I mean, once you started getting into it and delving into it and then you made the decision at a certain point to be with the dying. That's like a very conscious decision one has to make at that point. What was that like when you were like, yeah. I mean, well, I came to the dying because they needed the most. They, when you die in the healthcare system, you're sort of seen as a medical failure, right? Because doctors actually, I love doctors, but they aren't trained, so much in the way of death and dying. There are some out there that specialize in death and dying, but for the most part, your general practitioners, if you die, they're like, oh, I failed. I didn't save them. They're not a survivor, that kind of language. So, that sort of perpetuates onto the patient. And when they go home on hospice care, it's like, the system almost just drops them and forgets about them. But that's where my work begins, is where the terminal diagnosis starts and the healthcare system, really stops. And I do work with my patients all the way through. So from their diagnosis, all the way through their disposition, meaning what they're going to do with their body after they die. Right.
So yeah, and they need so much resources. I mean, the lack of resources in the area of death and dying is ridiculous. Yeah. And that's why people tailspin through grief and loss and chaos. And in my practice, I actually try to reverse all of that. So by the time the death actually occurs, everybody's at peace.
Which is like, I mean, we're kind of somewhat glossing over it, but maybe like the greatest thing anyone could do for anyone. Like we don't think of it like that because we focus so much on our lives and living but I mean, we are going to die. No one has escaped it yet. And what you're describing, and I've been really lucky in my life to date that no one very close to me. My grandparents have passed away. I had a very good friend. That's actually not true. I had a very good friend who passed away from a rare blood disease at 24, a college friend, which was nuts. That was my first kind of like eye-opening, like holy shit experience.
Yeah, that's what death does to people. That's totally, it just wrecks you. It's like, you're different. you're different
Yeah.
afterwards, you know?
Yeah, it was one of those things that like I was, still pretty young. I was his age. So this was, I think,
Yeah.
still in my 20s, and we were just like all of our group of friends were just kind of in shock and awe, and like I didn't even realize how much it was affecting me
Right.
until, like a week after. It was crazy. But I mean, we're so unaccustomed to dealing with that because A, we don't talk about it, but B, what you're describing, when it actually happens, the idea that this could actually even be something that isn't a terrible, horrible
Right.
thing doesn't
Mhm.
even enter people's minds. I mean, like, how do
Right.
you begin to have that kind of discussion or bring that like energy, for lack of a better term, into,
Yeah.
that space when you're with the dying and the family of the dying? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, so my first point of contact with any client, I do consultations to sort of see what their situation is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the actual dying person that contacts me, and sometimes it's their family. But what we do is I do a roundtable death plan. That's what I call it. That's what I bill for. And we sit down, and this takes a couple hours, but we talk through exactly what the patient or client envisions, what their ideal ending would look like. We talk about what's realistic and what is likely, to happen. And then we get all their documents prepared, like advance directives,
Mm.
pulse DNR forms, which means do not resuscitate. I coordinate them with a hospice, but we sit down and we talk about death at this table. And it's kind of funny to see some of the family members be like, what the hell am I doing here? Until they see how they fit into the patient's process. Whether it be if they're the person that makes all the phone calls after they die, or if they're the person that's going to be washing the body, or if they're the person that's ordering Mexican food, for the family while all this is going on. Everybody that's around the client has a job.
Yeah.
And I think once they realize that, they're like, I'm a part of this. And it feels good, to work together as a team towards a really beautiful goal. And I mean, I've seen it time and time again, what it looks like to have a dying person have their whole family around them, hugging them, loving them while they go. I mean, I don't know what else could be better, but that's what we address in that initial plan. And people seem to really like that. Sometimes they take the plan and they do the work on their own, which is great. Sometimes they take the plan and I come back, in intervals. So it just depends what they want.
Well, it's funny to hear you talk about this because, you approach it kind of the same way I approach like my consulting clients. It's for marketing.
Exactly.
It's not for people who are dying, but it's something that like you're not going to have a tremendous amount of competition in this space just because as great of work as you're doing, it seems like our culture, if we're resistant to anything more than anything else, it's death and mortality, right? I mean, this is something like, so what do you see kind of like, what could you impart to people listening who maybe aren't going through a dying experience or have someone who's dying with them or haven't even gone through it? Like, what can we do as individuals to kind of broaden our perspective of what death is and what the dying process is like?
Get closer to the dying. That would be my advice to anyone who hasn't experienced some kind of loss, because it will happen to you. There's no avoiding it. Your parents will die, your spouse will die, your pets will die. Yeah. Which is what I'm most afraid of. My dog is my child. So, and I'd also, so get closer to dying, volunteer to hospice. Don't be afraid of elderly people just because they're old and, might not be as young and beautiful as us. Go talk to them, volunteer, get closer to it. And I'd also give a little bit of historical perspective because as a ex-historian.
Museum. Yeah.
Like my history background's playing out here a little bit because it's important to understand where we lost our connection with death in America. And this is a very American thing that has happened to us. We're looking at the Civil War. Okay, so pre-Civil War, we're like in Victorian period, and we have no qualms with death in the Victorian period, right? We are having people die in the home. The hospitals aren't a thing. we're caring for our dead. We're laying them out in the parlor room for a week, so family can travel and come see. We're dressing our dead. We're photographing our dead, even children. I mean, we've all seen the pictures of the dressed up dead babies and, holding hands and stuff. It's like, okay, so how did we go from that to all of a sudden we're paying the funeral industry $45,000+ to take our loved one off of our hands.
Right.
If we actually look after the Victorian era at the Civil War, that's when the technology of embalming actually came around. And President Lincoln was actually a pretty big proponent of that. I mean, people were paying embalmers, privately to go find their loved ones and pump them full of chemicals so they could come back less decomposed. So again, we're managing our terror. We're dealing with the crisis of the Civil War. Lincoln had his own son embalmed because, his wife had a pretty difficult time grieving their son.
Yeah.
And of course, Lincoln himself was famously embalmed and taken around the country for 3 weeks or something. He was like the ultimate embalmed body. And actually, the embalmer who embalmed Lincoln said he never wanted to be embalmed himself because that stuff is toxic, which is a huge reason why I am a proponent against embalming in my own practice. So after the Civil War, what we see is all of a sudden we're calling professionals in to take care of our dying because we're disconnected from it. We're traumatized. Again, it goes back to that terror management. So that's when we see the rise of the funeral industry, also the rise of hospitals and industrial medicine. So you can kind of see how we got more and more separated over time. And now here we are.
It's really interesting. I listened to a biography of an audiobook of Ulysses S. Grant. So I have a lot of Civil War knowledge and just the carnage and just kind of the dark shadow aspect of the United States really rearing its head. And obviously before that date, the amount of death and carnage was just it was like a hell. Like for us to try to imagine that when we walk outside and go to the store, take a nice walk, it was just like a hellscape for what was the United States then. It's really interesting. And it makes sense in a lot of ways that's where the disconnect happened, because who can stare that in the face? Who can stare the terror? And we're talking about it, conceptually and somewhat abstractly. If everyone you knew from your town went off to fight in the regiment and 3 of them came back out of 75, your whole world is drastically different. And it's interesting that we also see kind of the industrial capitalist system fill that void immediately.
Immediately. It's so American. The story is so American. It just, I mean, if we look at, other cultures, Buddhists, Judaism, Muslims, they don't deal with, they practice green burial and, washing their dead and all that kind of stuff. It's really it's middle class, non-denominational Christian Americans that are really struggling with this.
Well, yeah. And I mean, that culture, is superimposed onto most of our lives because that's kind of the dominator culture of where we are. So what do we do to kind of educate ourselves to outside of being with the dying, which is clearly the best thing to do. But I'm going to be completely honest. I don't think a lot of people, I think it's going to be a small subset of people who are like, you know what, I'm going to do that right now. Because again, whether it's fear, time, or just the modern stresses of being a human being, what do we do to shift our own perspectives kind of on how to approach this, even if it's a far away or just a concept to us? How do we fight that kind of artificial capitalist denial approach to death? How do we begin to change our minds on this?
I think the best thing, other than familiarizing ourselves with death, is also to consider the fact of choice here. So the my body, my choice might inspire a lot of people. It's if you don't make plans, if you don't tell people what you want, and you die in a car accident or something, you're not going to have your body's, you're not going to have any control over what happens and who's making medical decisions. So putting yourself in that situation, and I might be a little bit hard into this because I worked in healthcare and trauma and hospice for so long, but make a plan. I know it's hard to think about, but make a plan. I mean, you have a wife and kids. I doubt you have an advance directive.
Definitely not. We tried to get a will done once. The lawyer flaked on us and we never did it again. And now we just talk about how we should probably get a will and instructions, and we don't even do that.
Yeah. See, it's like, sit down with a couple of beers or something and just be like, all right, this is not going to be pleasant, but let's talk about this. And it's for you, most of all, selfishly, we want to protect ourselves. But then also, like, as your family starts to grow older, one day it might be up to your kid, to make these decisions. So you don't want to put burdens on other people either. The more clear of a plan that you lay out, the easier it is for people to follow.
Right. And it also, it's like anything, like if you are just doing goal setting, not that it's a goal to die, but when you write it down and when you actually come up and structure something, even if consciously that doesn't change your perspective, unconsciously you have radically altered how you're engaging with something that, let's be clear, I mean, I think outside of just the fear of the not knowing what's going to happen, just the idea of oblivion, I think, for people is what really gets some people. So this is where I kind of want to but move into the part of the discussion where we go into kind of the more mystical and esoteric stuff, because the truth is I've spoken to one other person, I think, who's really been around the dying, and that's Joan Halifax. I've had the pleasure of knowing her for several years and just, did pioneering work on a lot of this stuff.
I love her book.
Oh God, she's the coolest. So what is your take? And she has a very different perspective on death from her Zen perspective at this point than me. I know you've witnessed a lot of things, specifically in Michael Donovan's interview with you in conversation, you get into some stuff and we'll certainly talk about that. But what is from being around the dying so many times and kind of making this your work, what can you glean about what happens, not necessarily after you die, but what is happening during the dying process outside of just the physical extinguishment of life?
You use the word oblivion, and I kind of like that word. And recently I've been thinking a lot about how before birth and after death are probably a lot of the same. And so I think we're in oblivion on both ends, I mean, it's complicated to go through, what you think about after death. I also kind of believe that whatever you believe is real. And when people go through this, they almost seem to have an individualized process. Like, they'll see their own family members, weeks before they die, and they'll start talking to them and reaching out to them. I mean, this happens like 90% of the time. I know that's a high percentage, but it's true. It's actually something I look for as a stage in dying to see how close they are. And usually they're about a couple weeks out, when they start to hallucinate a little bit. Our brain, I don't know if it's our brain or if that we're so close to the veil, when we're dying that we kind of go back and forth. I actually believe that.
Yeah. Me too.
I see people go back and forth through the veil, and also very much in dreams. I think there's a huge connection between dreaming and death and sort of the afterlife in dreams. I mean, how many of us have had dreams where we interact with our dead loved ones?
Well, that's also like Jung's quintessential example of synchronicity is someone having a precognitive or exact time, no possible way of influencing it in either direction, something related to death or a big catastrophe. That's like classic.
Yes, exactly.
Dreams and death are two of my favorite subjects. One, because we don't speak about them enough, both of them enough, but dreams at least are more acceptable to people. I mean, this is where the kind of liminal boundaries between reality and stuff we can't perceive. This is the wheelhouse for me. Just because I love this stuff. I don't know if you know this, but the reason, and I don't go into this every episode, that would be a shitty podcast, but the reason this show is called Synchronicity is I had an experience in the early 2000s. I was in my early 20s where I took a normal dose of LSD something
Okay.
I had done many times before, and had an experience where for the following 3 months, I was tripping. And I didn't take any more drugs after that. I was just tripping for 3 straight months, and everything. And I cannot stress this aspect enough, was one giant synchronicity, and it
Yeah.
extended through my waking life and my dream life, which is what was really freaking me out at the time, is because like there was no ceasing of realities. They were connected in a very real way. And so retrospectively, I've unpacked that and kind of, helped put it into perspective as best I can into my life, and, the practicability of something like that. But one thing it showed me is that there are aspects of reality that we're not privy to with our five senses and our conscious mind, which is somewhat of a cliche at this point, but very much a real thing. And when these things kind of merge and overlap, it can shake us out of what we kind of normally view as day-to-day life. So what I guess the question is when basically what I'm saying is the veil was lifted for me for an extended period of time, which is overwhelming, incredibly overwhelming, because
Sounds terrifying.
It truly was. And I mean, talk about like facing death. So what was essentially happening, in any given moment or day is if I started thinking I was dying, I'm dying. It's like a psychedelic trip where you're having a bad trip, you're dying, you're actually going through the ego death of that point. All those things are happening. So it was terrifying, but it also, luckily, having a good support system to help me, out of the situation months later when I finally crashed. I have at least some perspective on what it's like to live in that world, but still be in this world. So it's not the same as dying. It's not the same as being around people who are dying. But
it might be. I think there's a strong connection to the psychedelic experience and the dying experience.
For sure. I mean, and Joan Halifax, our friend there, also speaks about this and was very interested in doing that, along with Stanislav Grof, who was her husband. But my question is this: is what is your personal? I'm having you move out of your professional capacity and move into the personal kind of relationship with death and beyond. I mean, where does reincarnation fit in this for you?
I believe in reincarnation, which is interesting because I don't really have any specific religious beliefs. But I do. I don't know. It's sort of an inner knowing that I have that I'm way older than I actually am.
Yeah.
And that I've been alive before somehow, somewhere. I believe it. And I think when we go into that oblivion, we're sort of resting and recalibrating and seeing where we're going to come back down and fit into the order of things at a different time.
Yes.
And that gives me hope. I mean, reincarnation might be a form of denial, of death denial. It kind of gives me a little bit of hope, but I'm also going to be just fine if I die and nothing happens, right? It's going to, whatever that oblivion is, it's not necessarily a conscious space. So I would like for myself to be reincarnated and to, have a greater purpose in this world and keep coming back and keep improving or whatever. But I might just be worm food, and that's okay for me too. I want to nourish the earth. And I won't know any otherwise. So,
and it can be both too, I think is really what it probably is in this sense. I mean, I stake out pretty firm, it's not firm ground, but a firm stance in terms of, I very much believe in reincarnation. What you're describing also with the oblivion is very much in line with the Tibetan Buddhist ideas of reincarnation, right? And the Bardo states of these intermediary states between life and death even. And, there's a whole complex kind of hierarchy and kind of cosmology of how that all works. But it essentially is what you're describing. Like, we can say that there's no real purpose to it, but like the same reason that I don't think this is your first birth in life is because it's probably focusing on death is not what people do the first time around. Right. There's probably a lot of other things to pursue, but it's weird. I mean, what are people's perspective? This is where I want to merge kind of what you're doing and your beliefs. Like, when people come to you, what percentage of them come with firm beliefs about what happens after death, and how many of them are malleable, and
Yeah.
kind of what do you notice from different subsets and different depending on their belief systems and all that? I know that's kind of a complicated question, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
I do. And, you know, the answer is that people who are very religious and attend, church or temple or whatever regularly, they actually have a built-in support system.
Mhm.
So I don't work with the extremely religious very much because they kind of they've already thought about this kind
That's
of stuff
interesting.
in their own way. So the people I work with are usually spiritual, not religious
Mm.
or agnostic or atheistic. And that, I mean, I don't believe in a true atheist. I believe that even if you
Right.
don't
Agree.
believe in God, you have a belief system, which is not to believe in a deistic God, which is totally fine. You might be a
Right.
humanist, you don't know. So, everybody has something that they work through, but my clients tend to be more open or maybe not as dogmatic in their beliefs.
Mm, mm.
Mhm.
So when they're coming to you, do you see how does their relationship, as someone who's, let's say I'm diagnosed and I know that I have, maybe 2 or 3 months to live. What changes do you typically see someone go through, irrespective of their family and kind of support systems? Like what begins to happen typically? And I know like every person, each death is different. They're not all the same, but what are kind of the general processes and themes that you see happen to someone?
Yeah, yeah. So I like 1 to 3 months out of dying, you'll notice that people sort of do like a bit of a social withdrawal.
Mhm.
And it's really at that point that I see them, because the more you begin to die, there's like grades of dying, right?
Yeah.
The more you start to die, the more within yourself you become until you're actually totally unconscious and probably moving in, throughout, back and forth over the veil
Yeah.
without people really knowing.
Yes.
'Cause dying people, if you die naturally or whatever, you usually first begin to socially withdraw, and then you begin to withdraw from even food and water until you're just like a sleeping, unconscious being. And then you sort of slip into the death. So yeah, noticing when people start to not be so interested in their human life anymore. And that's hard for the family because, they want to get closer during this time, which is totally, there's ways to get closer, just by touch and, using other senses,
Right.
talking with them, all there's stuff like that. So, but yeah, it's usually dying is about a 3-month process if it goes quote unquote naturally.
Yeah. It's interesting to me how people kind of naturally, I mean, the body is dying, so you understand there'd be less external contact, but it's interesting that there's this kind of built-in way to die for people, even if the emotions and psychology and situations are different, but it is this kind of internal knowingness, and people
Yeah.
repeat these similar patterns. Now, I saw and heard you talk about something else that I think is really interesting. And my grandmother had dementia, and I heard, you said something during the episode with Michael that I thought was amazing, because my grandma was pretty far out there. She thought she was pregnant. She's like 80 something years old, is having quintuplets and all of these things.
Yeah.
But I was actually like, my mom and my aunts were very distraught and upset because I think they saw the person who they knew, that identity kind of get stripped away into something
Right.
else. But for me as a grandson who, grew up not as a grandchild, I wasn't directly around this person for all of my life. I was able to kind of engage her in her dementia, and she was happy. She was genuinely happy during this. And it was clear to me now, was she engaging with reality at all? At our reality? Not really. And that was very troublesome. So I'm curious, because I know you work with dementia patients too.
Yeah.
What are the differences? Because I know there's a ton of similarities, but what are some of the differences of working with someone who's maybe losing their sense of self and everyone else, their relationship to everyone else, and someone who's physically not going to be there?
Yeah, it's actually a totally different kind of client for me. So cancer is my wheelhouse just because I have a passion for it and a personal vendetta against it. But An Alzheimer's dementia patient, they're totally different. It's not their body that's against them, it's their mind. So their process actually goes on for years, and they're very hard to predict because some days they will start to withdraw and you'll see them start to go through the whole death withdrawal, and then they'll just pop right back up and eat lunch, and everything's fine. It's strange how they kind of bounce up and down, which can be very, very trying on the family, especially the kids of that parent. Because you have to make decisions for them. Do I put them in a memory care thing? And then you have to choose how you're going to interact with them. And when I work in memory care units, you can walk up and down the halls and you can see family members just like sitting in the room with their loved ones and not really knowing how to act.
Yeah.
And the truth is, even if they don't know who you are or what you're doing, if you just, excuse me.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry.
If you just sit down and put your arm around them and look them in the eyes and say, I love you so much, they're going to get that feeling. They're going to get that emotive,
connection.
boost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Connection, something they still feel, every kind of emotion, probably hyper. So if you need to enter the delusion that they're having, enter it. Who cares? Correcting them is not going to have any kind of benefit for you or them. It's just going to be frustrating for everybody. So it's much harder. I get it. My grandma had dementia and she thought there was like a meth lab next door and that I don't even know if she knew what a meth lab was.
Oh, geez.
She definitely, came up with this delusion. And so we used to laugh and joke about it and just go with it. What else can you do? You got to laugh through some stuff, right? That's
really important that you say that too. And it's good to hear because, I think, again, whether it's death or dementia or Alzheimer's, like, I think a lot of the not knowing how to act and what to do and what to say also just adds like the second arrow thing. Like you already have an arrow in you and you're shooting yourself again just because you're obsessing now about the social interaction. So, I mean, like, how do you, let's say someone who has just lost someone, someone close to them. Yeah. What do you typically say to someone in that situation? I think I know there's the I'm sorry for your loss, I'm there for you. What do you like to say to someone who's just lost someone?
One foot in front of the other if you can, you just got to let them be a grieving person. We have such a stigma against grief in this American society. What do we get? Like 3 days of like corporate bereavement time. It's like, I don't even get over the flu in 3 days. You expect me to get over a death.
Yeah. Jesus.
And I think we also move away from grievers because, again, grievers show us how painful death can be because it is painful. It's the opposite of love, right? Grief, all the love that we felt for that person, that grief is going to come back and hit us pretty hard. Yeah. That's, in a way a beautiful thing. But for new grievers, I mean, they're not even, for the first month, their head is in a fog. And people don't even realize that. People are at the death,
right,
for the first week or so, and they're around, you're getting food and attention and cards and love and flowers. And then 2 weeks later, everybody's gone.
Yes.
And you're in this like fog of like, oh my God, my whole life is being restructured because my dad just died or my spouse just died. And, when my dad died, I didn't get out of bed for 2 months. I didn't work. I actually ate quite a bit. Like I didn't eat. That's not true. I ate everything and drank everything. But, just allowing people the space to go through it, however that looks for them. There's a great book out there for grievers by this woman named Megan Devine. Maybe it's Devine, but it's called Okay, It's Okay, You're Not Okay. And I think that's a great thing to say to grievers. Just, hey, it's okay. And if you do small things for them, like, hey, can I come walk your dog? Or do you need dinner tonight? And they can just kind of figure out what's best for them. But I think just knowing that they're going to be in it for a while.
Yeah. I mean, my friend several years ago, his dad died, and I just remember, he's one of my best friends, my best friend. He basically, I remember speaking to him, I don't know, 2 months after the fact. And I was just checking in and he's like, he could be candid with me. He's like, the hardest part is just everyone forgets, like everyone else except you and the immediate people who are affected by this. Like they go on with their lives and you stop getting the, I'm sorry for your losses. You stop getting, how are you doing? And you start to feel the loss even more acutely because it's like everyone else has forgotten, you're still going through this thing. And again, this really speaks to kind of where we started with this, which is we need to start talking. That's why I'm so excited for this episode. Like anything, any small part of bringing this into the conversation, any ability to laugh at death and laugh at these things as well, and lighten kind of the soberness of the situation and the solemnness, like that needs to be embraced, because like, as we've spoken, like you can't stem the tide of death. It is, you can't do it.
I really like the combination of death and comedy. I try not to take myself too seriously, but some of the best laughs I've had have been over some dark, funny shit, it's sometimes we just gotta laugh.
And again, this is, I think these are the things that people have a hard time confronting, but that someone who can, like you, who can be around the dying, face, as much as we're talking about it lightening the mood, it's still a very difficult and painful experience, not necessarily physically for everyone, but the idea of losing this world and yourself and your family is not going to be a pleasant experience for most people. And the ability to kind of maintain a sense of humor and laugh at shit still, like, it'd be one thing if we were having this conversation and you were talking to me kind of like a funeral director and all, like a mortician, like, oh yes, it's quite bad being around dying. Like that's the last thing we need to attach to this process, because that's not going to help anyone kind of latch on and understand that there's value here. So that leads me to my next question, which is, if you were going to say there's not one, but maybe a few takeaways from all of your time spent with dying people and families, like what would you want to say? Like, what have you learned is kind of the main thing about being around dying people?
I think number one, the more you touch and physically like connect with the dying, I think the more you understand. And we talked about that more. And again, when we looked at that historical perspective, we stopped touching our dead, and what, psychologically that's brought us to a darker place than we know or expected. So, try to do that, if you can. Don't be afraid to do that. And I want to empower people to have courage, I suppose. If you don't have any other connection with death, try a death meditation. And these are actually something that I facilitate here in Los Angeles. And they started over actually in South Korea, something called living funerals, where you can go and you like write your own obituary. You're staring at a picture of yourself that has your birth date, and then that day's date is your death date. And we go through a whole like letting go of each of your fingers, your toes, saying goodbye to each of your body parts. It's like a 3-hour meditation. It's pretty long. Yeah. And then also, meditating through your subconscious, like, how, imagine what it's like to be like drifting away and letting go, and the world gets smaller and smaller. So these meditations have actually had a profound, everyone who attends them is just like, whoa, like my whole life is different. My friend who does these in Texas, Emily Cross, she said someone came out of her living funeral and was like, I got to get a divorce, because it was so like life altering.
Yes.
And so it can be a really scary thing. People who show up to these are definitely scared, but they come out and they're connected, with their own mortality.
Yes.
So I might suggest doing some of those, getting close, reading, of course. If you want to read some good modern death denial philosophy, I would suggest the book, The Worm at the Core, by Sheldon Solomon. Very, very good stuff. Or just look him up on YouTube. He's brilliant. He looks like the dude. He wears like a Bob Marley shirt, and then he talks like like the most brilliant philosopher you've ever.
I love it.
It's like, I love the dichotomy. It's so good.
I love that. Well, the meditations sound very interesting because, one of my favorite mystics from the East is RamanaMaharshi, and he famously, whether you believe this or not, became enlightened when he did exactly that. He laid down one day, I think he was like 12 or 11, and is like, I'm dead now.
Awesome.
And he kept asking the question, who am I? Who am I? And he kept going through this. And it essentially was this same process of saying goodbye to each part of his body, the whole thing. And then he was enlightened, and weird magical and mystical things started to take place around him. And he was generally recognized as, a very pure and wise person. And also one of the few people throughout history who never really got accused of doing anything fucked up, which is great. So, but it really does kind of point to this idea that if we can let go of just our physical body and the mortality and our fear of losing that connection, sense of self, and that can be such a liberating experience. I mean, this is why people go to the jungle and take ayahuasca, right? They want to get jolted out of their body psychically and come to these realizations like they need to get a divorce. It's a very similar thing. I mean, it
is. It's another kind of, it's like a sober ego death.
Yes. But I mean,
that's exactly how I explain it to people.
Well, and it makes it's just as valid. And then we can get into the weird placebo effects of some of these psychedelics too, because I mean, I think inherently we all have this ability to kind of let go of these psychic and psychological shackles that we kind of build ourselves, but also kind of get foisted onto us. And anything we can do, psychedelics are great. I love them. I think meditations are great too.
Me too.
Very much. I mean, there's a lot of things I do that I really very much enjoy, but I will say the one that I think I continuously shy away from is any real work with death. And that's why I think using it as a tool or modality or perspective to look through kind of, this illusory aspect of life, or what even life means through the lens of death, is that's really fucking powerful stuff, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. Well, what else? I mean, I could literally ask questions forever about death, but what else would you want to say about the death and dying process? If there's,
I mean, okay, so we just touched a little bit on psychedelics, and I just want to comment on that for a second, because right now there's a lot of research and also a lot of laws that are passing. Oregon and Colorado, just legalized the use of psilocybin.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's medicinally or recreational, but
they decriminalized it. So basically what they said is that they basically said we're not going to arrest or do anything about this.
Okay,
so go for it.
So it's like slowly but surely, just like weed, came around. It's probably going to come around, which is great. I'm a big fan of psilocybin. When I use it to get in touch with my inner mother, my inner wisdom.
Totally.
And also to I use it to recalibrate myself, or, get back in nature. But really there's an inner person that I like to connect with when I use psychedelics. And that's really powerful. And I've been reading a lot of research about how dying people are using psychedelics, and everybody's sort of latching onto this idea, but it's been my experience that sick people do not want to take drugs.
Yes.
Okay. They do not feel good. They're already throwing up and in pain and possibly on opiates or whatever. It's I don't know why people are thinking that you're going to take psychedelics on your deathbed, because you're already on a psychedelic trip on your deathbed. Ego deaths with, psilocybin or whatever, any kind of psychedelic, is for the living to explore death.
Yes.
Not for the dying. They're all leave them alone. Do it before, they get to that point. Do your psychedelics before. Have your trips while you're alive to understand death. Not on by the time you're on your deathbed, it's too late.
Yes. So this is incredibly important to talk about. So we're not all going to be Aldous Huxley getting injected intravenously with LSD as we pass away. That's because we're not all writing Brave New World. So here's the thing. This is why it's so important is I had a really good discussion with Catherine McLean, who was part of the Johns Hopkins psilocybin experiences that specifically worked with dying people, and she shared an experience of someone who basically freaked the fuck out, and he was a terminal patient. And we're talking about something we were kind of talking about earlier with the Civil War and the capitalism stuff. There is an effort, a corporate effort, and it is being aided and abetted by organizations that people somewhat trust and think are trying to do good things for psychedelics. There is an effort to monetize psychedelics. And one of the first places they're looking at to do that is specifically with psilocybin as an antidepressant, which, just to be clear, is a fucking terrible idea. And I love mushrooms. I think if you take them at the proper setting and reverence, you can really, really do some special things. But to think that we're going to clinically and allotropically deal with psychedelics as we would, even with something like cannabis, we don't have a psilocybinoid system. We have an endocannabinoid system, so it's a completely different trajectory. And I couldn't agree more. I think psychedelics can give us a wonderful glimpse into the dying process. And, maybe for the very astute and veteran psychedelic taking person, you could take psychedelics around a dying person and have an amazing experience. But for the actual dying, what a stressor. Holy shit. For most people, especially if you haven't done it, which I think anyone who's done it probably isn't going to really want to do it when they're dying.
Right.
So.
I mean, and if someone's been on chemo, I mean, it's just, I can't, I've been racking my brain trying to understand why people think this is such a good idea, when like I said, my experience around dying people is that they're too sick.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's a great idea. I think psychedelics are for the living and for our own egos, not for people who are fragile in their health.
Yeah. It's No, I think it's a really important thing to talk about, because people are looking. So I'm still in New York, where weed is illegal. Like, it's just flat out illegal. Like,
poor thing.
You don't even know. This weed is my spirit animal too. No one loves it more than me. So it's really just like, I just want to be able to grow it. I fucking love it. I might
give you a run for your money. I don't know.
Oh, then now we know why we're getting along. But basically, I see the paths that have happened in other places for legalization. I see them even in Massachusetts, which is like an hour away from me. It's corporate, right? These big companies have come in and kind of dominated the landscape. This is absolutely what is planned with psychedelics. All of this clinical research is not just so we can open the floodgates of human consciousness and have a better, more open-minded society. Like, there are clear interests going into this stuff. And I think intuitively, just and anecdotally from your own experience, you've keyed in on that. Like, this is probably not the best application. And the worst thing that could happen is that this is the plan. This is how we're starting to treat people. And then all of a sudden shit starts going wrong, which it's already been shown to happen. And the disservice it would do to something as amazing like psilocybin or any of these psychedelics for people who aren't dying or aren't dealing with psychological issues. I mean, that would be a travesty.
Right. Yeah. And it's like monetizing sacred medicine, I feel. And actually, now that you say that there's like forces behind it, I remembered having a conversation with my partner, who is actually a chemical engineer and works in big pharma. So, and I remember him saying how big it was that psilocybin got some kind of like FDA clearance that like nothing gets. Like, it got some kind of like pharmaceutical clearance for research that was, pretty high up. Yeah. So
that actual
turning.
Yeah, that process, from what I understand from speaking people who are behind the scenes and know a lot of the players and were actively involved, basically what ended up happening is there were a group of people who have been trying to legalize psychedelics for decades. And some of them, there's all these different factions, right? It's never one coalition that's all on the same page. It's just not how shit works. We know that. But essentially, people with very noble and altruistic motivations and intentions were basically used as pawns to get certification and FDA approval and make sure that everything was done on the up and up. And once there started to be kind of questions raised about not only the ethics and kind of application of psychedelics, but also some of the sexual abuse things that were popping up in these clinical studies, just like really rampant stuff. There were warning signs. A lot of those people quickly kind of got the brush off and were like, thank you, but no thanks, we're good on our own. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this develops in the next 5 to 10 years. But I'm really glad you brought up in the context of dying, because it just sounds like a truly terrible idea.
Yeah, it does. I don't know why everybody's latching onto it.
It's really weird. Jill, this has been amazing. I would actually love to have you on again for another chat about this stuff, because we spoke a lot about death, but I feel like there's a lot of other ground we could cover, just getting a sense of what you're interested in, what you're doing. The history, I love history, by the way. It's like one of my favorite. Too. It's great. I got on a Ron Chernow kick 2 years ago, all of his biographies, and man, holy shit, they're like tomes. They're like 800-page books, and I have
I know, my dad used to carry them around.
They're so good.
My dad is also a historian, so
okay. Awesome.
It's in the blood.
Oh, it's so cool. Well, and I think what's cool about history too is that it is so cyclical, and to understand kind of these patterns that repeat and kind of the etymology and where these things come from just gives us so much insight. Like, I think that point about the Civil War and kind of Americans, that's so fucking poignant.
It gives me hope, if history is cyclical, maybe I'm literally trying to bring back like Victorian death practices, like having the dead in the home, washing our own dead, leaving them there for, a few days, whatever you need. So I'm like literally trying to bring that back. So, maybe this is the time. I'm hoping that we can get back to those practices and move away from corporatized and medicalized death,
which I've never even thought about as a thing. It was just, that's how it happens until you mentioned it. Truthfully, like I never thought that there was some corporatized, like it was like, this is what happens. You go to do this. This is, you do this now.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. I could do a whole expose on the funeral industry and my feelings on them.
Yeah, so. That's pretty awesome that you pointed that out. So, all right, before we get to the questions that I end the show with, where can people find you? I'll have links to everything too, but if people are like, you know what, I need these services, I'm interested, what can people do to get in touch with you?
You can go to my website, deathdoulala.com, and send me an email, or you can call me, and I'm happy to offer you a consultation and hopefully move forward and make a death plan for you. You can be healthy or dying. It doesn't matter. So you can find me at deathdoulala.com. And I have a blog, going there. And, there's a lot of information. I have events that I post there. So play around with the website. There's a lot of good stuff.
It's a really nice site. And I do this for a living. It was actually quite pleasant to use. And I don't say that very often. Yeah, it's very nice. You did a good job. So questions towards the end. Here we go. Okay. What's your favorite color?
The color that just popped into my head was blue.
Very nice. What's your favorite number?
24.
Why 24?
It's a really nice, like, even number, right? It kind of boils down and down. Doesn't it boil? What does it boil down to? I'm not sure, but I'm born on the 24th, and I don't know. I like that nice even number.
The 24th of what?
January. I'm an Aquarius.
Very cool. Very cool. What's your favorite animal?
Dogs.
Nice. Dog. I think it's the most common answer, but also very understandable why it is.
Yeah, I'm just like so connected to my dog.
What kind of dog do you have?
He's like a Dachshund Terrier mix, and he's so cute. He has a little mohawk. We cut on him, and he's a cutie boy. He runs around. I'm so happy. He just like radiates happiness. That's why I love him.
What's his name?
Monty.
Very nice. Last question. What's a practical tip that's helped you in your life that you could share with people listening?
Oh, practical tip that's helped me in my life has been compartmentalization. So for example, when I'm working, I'm totally present in my work, but when I'm not working, I let everything go. I don't bring it home. I keep it in a certain area. And that's how I enjoy the rest of my life. I live a really rich life. I really do. I have a great love in my life. I have great friends. I have a good family system, and we live, we really live. But I don't think I'd be able to do that if I didn't compartmentalize my work as much as I do. So just keeping time for your authentic you, and then, keeping time for the working you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll say this just from speaking with you now and briefly the other day, it's refreshing to hear someone who's around death be so joyful and happy. Just, and like you can tell from speaking with someone, like that is a very positive reminder that this isn't something that's going to fuck up your life. In fact, it can enhance it in so many amazing ways.
It is. It's life affirming. It really is. I mean, yeah. And I'm also happy to say that everyone around me has their like advance directive and stuff filled out.
Yeah.
If anything does happen to anybody, like we're all good.
Me and my wife are having a conversation tonight about this, if anything. So Jill, thank you so much for coming on. Let's do it again in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Noah. This was really great.
Awesome. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to that episode. Jill, go check her out. deathdoulala.com. She's cool. If she resonated with you, if you resonated with her, you know what to do. You know how to do it. She does free consultations, so that's pretty fucking awesome. Tell her Noah said hi. That's it for this episode. Rate and review the podcast if you would. That would be amazing. Four Sigmatic, big thanks to them. They're great. You know how to get their stuff. Do it. New sponsor coming next week. Pretty excited about them. Very excited. Very, very, very excited. There'll also be guests on the show, which was my suggestion. They did not ask for that, but I was very much impressed with who they are. So look forward to that. That's it. Oh, did I mention the Synchronicity playlist on Spotify? Follow me. I put together Synchronicity playlist. The music I'm listening to. There's 15. 16's coming around the corner. I'll let you know. Go check that out. Okay. See you next week.